Establishing central presence, this pawn launch immediately contests key squares and dictates the game's initial direction. Developing a knight early, this move sets up flexibility and challenges white's central control, preparing to contest key squares. Developing a knight to f3 offers flexibility, preparing castling and potentially controlling central squares later. Establishing a central pawn duo immediately challenges white's control and opens up diagonals for black's pieces. Planning a kingside fianchetto, preparing to pressure black's center from afar with the bishop. Challenging the center's pawn structure directly, creating immediate positional dynamism and opening lines for active piece play. Developing the bishop to g2 solidifies the pawn chain and prepares to fianchetto, indirectly challenging black's central grip. Exchanging pawns on d4 immediately opens lines, potentially favoring quicker development for white given their advanced king's bishop. Securing the monarch offers immediate safety and frees up pieces for the impending central struggle. This bishop maneuver aims to connect the rooks and prepare for central pawn pushes while securing the queen's flank. Recapturing the pawn with the knight immediately reintroduces a central piece, aiming to challenge black's burgeoning pawn structure and gain tempo by potentially attacking other pieces. This action is a direct response, a strategic assertion of presence in the core of the board. Challenging the knight directly, black aggressively claims central space and seeks to disrupt white's knight coordination before castling. Asserting control of the central dark squares, this knight repositioning preempts black's potential pawn advances and creates a subtle but significant positional advantage, limiting the mobility of black's pieces while preparing for a potential kingside attack. Challenging white's queenside grip, black repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to contest the d4 square and potentially pressure white's center with future pawn pushes. This placement also prepares for development of the queenside pieces, a subtle but crucial step in solidifying black's position. Initiating an immediate pressure on black's light-squared bishop aims to disrupt their developing harmony and potentially expose their king later by creating an unbalanced pawn structure. Solidifying the central pawn and preparing to redeploy the knight to a more active square, this piece repositions itself defensively, anticipating potential pawn pushes from white and reinforcing the queenside structure. The knight's current placement guards the bishop on e6 and contributes to the overall solidity of black's position, suggesting a desire to weather white's early initiative. Solidifying central control and preparing for further development, this maneuver subtly repositions the knight to a more active diagonal, eyeing potential weaknesses in black's structure and offering a flexible defense to the queenside pawns. Consolidating the king's bishop, this maneuver prepares for a potential kingside castling and reinforces the central pawn structure. Unveiling the queen now seeks to dominate the center, eyeing potential pressure on black's kingside while also preparing for a potential kingside pawn storm should black commit to castling in that direction. This forward placement creates immediate tension, forcing black to consider their defensive structure and where to redeploy their own pieces to counter this new, centralized threat. Securing the king behind a pawn wall is paramount, a natural instinct after the recent central skirmishes. This maneuver tidies up the position and readies the rook for potential activity along the newly cleared f file. It prepares for the strategic ebb and flow, anticipating how the upcoming piece exchanges might alter the board's landscape and open avenues for counterplay. Securing the central d-file, white's rook now eyes the enemy king, hinting at potential future pressure or a coordinated attack on the queen side if black isn't careful. This pawn push immediately stakes a claim in the center, forcing white's pieces to reevaluate their comfortable positions and potentially creating a passed pawn down the line if supported. Initiating a pawn structure alteration, white exchanges the bishop for a knight, creating doubled pawns for black in the center which, while potentially a weakness, also opens a diagonal for black's queen and frees the d-file for white's rook. This decision signals a shift in white's strategy, moving away from an immediate tactical onslaught towards a more positional squeeze, aiming to exploit the structural imbalances that will inevitably arise as the game progresses. Reclaiming that knight offers a chance to solidify the central pawn structure and initiate a more active piece play, though it does momentarily cede some central presence. Shifting the knight to e4 immediately challenges black's central pawn structure and prepares a potential outpost, creating fascinating spatial dynamics. Centralizing the queen on c7 offers a dual purpose. It supports the advanced d4 pawn and prepares potential queenside expansion with rc8 or b6, while simultaneously eyeing the weak squares around white's king. Initiating a central pawn exchange to simplify while simultaneously forcing black's knight to a less active square strategically pivots towards a more open game, potentially creating new lines of attack and reducing the complexity of the center. Reclaiming the bishop with bxf6 decisively solidifies black's central pawn structure and reestablishes the vital diagonal for the queen. Solidifying the queenside structure after the exchange, this pawn advance aims to gain more central breathing room and prepare for potential queenside expansion later, while also anchoring the knight on c3. Striking a tactical blow, black initiates a pawn exchange, aiming to unravel white's central pawn chain and potentially disrupt its coordination, though it does grant white a more open c-file. Reclaiming the pawn immediately reestablishes material balance, but more importantly, it unlocks white's queen to actively participate in the central skirmish, aiming to exploit the potentially weakened pawn structure on the queenside black might create. Black decisively captures the central pawn, simplifying the position and opening up the queenside for potential counterplay while simultaneously challenging white's control of the d4 square. The pawn structure now presents an interesting dichotomy: doubled c-pawns for white, a common structural weakness, but also a formidable central presence and open lines for white's pieces. This creates a fascinating positional trade-off, where white's development advantage and control of key diagonals might compensate for the slightly compromised pawn skeleton. The fight for the semi-open c-file intensifies as black repositions their rook, immediately contesting this critical open line. This maneuver prepares for potential pressure on white's c3 pawn and aims to activate the rook from its current, somewhat passive, position behind the knight. Consider the long-term implications of this rook transfer. It doesn't just claim the file, but also anticipates white's possible attempts to push their own pawns, creating dynamic imbalances. Securing the bishop on b7, white immediately targets black's poorly defended queenside pawn structure, initiating a dynamic imbalance by exchanging an active piece for a potentially backward pawn. The material has been balanced, but the structural integrity of white's queenside is now severely compromised, opening critical diagonal pathways for black's pieces and potentially creating lasting weaknesses. Regaining the pawn with bishop to d5 immediately rebalances material, but it does so by placing the bishop on a square where it's vulnerable to the c8 rook, creating a tactical tug-of-war for control of that vital diagonal. White is essentially sacrificing positional harmony for immediate material equality, betting that the bishop's activity can outweigh its precarious placement. This maneuver significantly impacts the pawn structure and opens up possibilities for both sides to exploit weaknesses on the queenside, as the exchange on c3 has left white's queenside pawn structure somewhat fragmented. Reclaiming the pawn on c3 is a natural instinct, but it opens up the b-file for the rook and introduces a rather passive bishop on h3. From this square, its influence is minimal, potentially becoming a target for white's advancing pawns or even an easy exchange once white resolves their central pawn structure. Consider how this bishop truly contributes to your position. Currently, it's more of a spectator than an active participant, which is a positional concession black can ill afford. Repositioning the bishop to its original diagonal seeks to restore some of the lost pressure along that crucial line, even though white has conceded a central pawn and black's pieces are becoming quite active. The aim is to find a more effective role for the bishop than being pinned down by the advanced black pawn on c3, and perhaps to prepare for potential kingside play or to contest the light squares. Retreating the bishop to e6 aims to consolidate black's position, reinforcing the central pawn structure and preparing to contest the now open c-file. This also offers the bishop a more active diagonal, looking towards white's kingside in some variations, and it cleverly avoids being immediately dislodged by a pawn advance. Reclaiming the open file and re-establishing a battery on the king's flank, white aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially exploit weaknesses. This bishop, having retreated twice, now seeks to harass white's queenside pawn structure, specifically eyeing that isolated c3 pawn and potentially disrupting white's coordination further. Reclaiming the open c-file is paramount after black's persistent pressure, aiming to dismantle white's slightly compromised queenside pawn structure and prevent any further infiltration or consolidation by black's bishops. Doubling rooks on the open c-file is paramount, as the a8h1 diagonal is firmly controlled by white's bishop, making it an ideal place for your rooks to coordinate and pressure the weak c2 pawn. The game has reached a critical juncture where material is equal, but the pawn structure presents a stark contrast. White's capture on c3 fundamentally alters the pawn landscape, effectively creating doubled, isolated pawns for black on the queen side. This structural weakness, while not immediately catastrophic, will become a persistent target for white's pieces throughout the ensuing middle game and potential endgame. The immediate compensation for white is a more harmonious piece deployment and the opening of the b-file, offering potential attacking avenues down that flank. Black, in turn, must now focus on defending these compromised pawns and finding active counterplay to offset the positional disadvantage. The material is now equal, but black has achieved a crucial positional goal by clearing the queens from the board, transforming this into an endgame where their rook on the open c-file and the bishop pair offer significant long-term pressure. The rook returns to the central file, aiming to pry open the queen side and leverage the open nature of the position. The rook exchange simplifies the position dramatically, immediately transitioning the game into an endgame where precise pawn play and knight maneuvering will be paramount for controlling the center and creating winning chances. A precise recapture solidifies white's material advantage, bringing the knight into active play while preparing to exploit the weakened queenside pawns. The bishop's journey to e7 signifies a re-evaluation of piece placement after the rook exchange, aiming to solidify the king's defenses and prepare for potential pawn pushes in the center or on the queen side. It's a quiet but crucial repositioning maneuver. Reclaiming the center's crucial diagonal influence, the knight repositions, aiming to contest control of the e-file and potentially fortify the d-pawn's advancement should the opportunity arise. Re-establishing piece harmony becomes paramount after the exchanges, and bringing the bishop back to a more active square like d6 aims to improve its scope, eyeing the central pawns and preparing for potential breakthroughs or defensive maneuvers should white try to advance further. This move aims to solidify white's pawn structure, preventing black from easily infiltrating the queen side, and also preparing to potentially advance the king or pawn on the king side later. Boldly repositioning the bishop to **d7** aims to consolidate the queenside pawn structure and prepare for potential rook activity on the newly opened file, while also keeping an eye on the central squares that white is attempting to dominate. Shifting the monarch to a more dynamic central square opens avenues for future pawn advances and allows the king to participate more actively in the game's unfolding drama, rather than remaining a passive spectator on the wing. Shifting the monarch towards the center signals a cautious intent to consolidate the position and prepare for potential future pawn advances, or to better support the pieces in the cramped central territory. Opening up the f-file now forcefully challenges the central pawn structure and aims to generate attacking possibilities against the black king, creating a more dynamic imbalance. The pawn capture on f4 opens a crucial diagonal for the white king, introducing immediate concerns about its safety as the queens have been exchanged. Resuming the pawn structure on the king side now that the immediate tactical skirmishes have resolved, opening a path for the king to potentially join the fray and reinforcing the central control with the new pawn chain. Reinforcing the kingside pawn structure offers some defensive stability, though it surrenders any aspiration to advance on the king side, essentially freezing that sector of the board and committing black to a more defensive posture. Opening the e-file creates immediate counterplay, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially exploit any weaknesses that arise from this aggressive pawn push. Reclaiming the pawn and activating the bishop to the queenside immediately challenges white's control over the open c-file, aiming to disrupt the pawn chain and create counterplay. Shifting the monarch towards the center, King Emmanuel, is a bold step, aiming to activate your royalty and participate in the ensuing pawn struggle, while also potentially offering a refuge from any lingering threats on the flanks. Reactivating the bishop's influence by shifting it to the queenside provides valuable support for the central pawn structure and prepares to contest control of the c-file, potentially challenging white's king's safety as the endgame approaches. Proactively securing the king's escape square on g2 with a timely pawn advance, preparing for potential king activity, or simply reinforcing the defensive structure before committing to further pawn pushing. Stepping the bishop to that square forces white's king to shuffle, subtly but effectively limiting its future mobility, and setting up potential discovered attacks down the central files if white isn't careful. Focusing on king's safety and centralization, the monarch relocates to a more commanding central square, aiming to support the pawn structure and prepare for potential maneuvering in the upcoming endgame. Solidifying the king's defensive perimeter becomes paramount after the pawn sacrifice, as the open kingside beckons potential invasions. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside to pry open lines for white's rooks and queen, capitalizing on black's somewhat passive king placement and the slight awkwardness of the bishop on b6. Seeking active squares for the bishop and disrupting white's pawn structure with a check offers a promising direction. The monarch ventures back into the fray, seeking a more active role as the pawns are about to become the primary battlefield. Seeking to disrupt white's king's safety and potentially open lines for further peace activity, black redirects their bishop to an aggressive outpost. This forces white's monarch to reposition once more, highlighting the pawn structure's vulnerability and the dynamic pressure black is applying. The king inches back towards safety, abandoning the active but exposed central square, a prudent retreat that prioritizes king security over immediate central occupation. A bold pawn thrust is initiated, aiming to dismantle white's central pawn structure and disrupt the harmony of black's pieces. This dynamic capture promises to open lines, potentially leading to sharper tactical exchanges and a shift in the positional balance. It's a gamble that could either unravel white's coordination or create weaknesses for black to exploit. Strikes at the heart of black's pawn chain, disrupting their carefully constructed defensive structure and opening a pathway for the knight towards a more active central position. Seeking to reroute the bishop to a more active square, a bold repositioning maneuver to pressure the enemy king's pawn shield. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside to dislodge the enemy king now becomes paramount as the queens are off the board, potentially leading to an endgame where king activity is crucial. The knight's daring repositioning to f1, a square it hasn't visited since its early foray, aims to exploit the newly opened diagonal towards white's king, simultaneously preparing for potential advances on the kingside, perhaps a prelude to a pawn storm or a tactical thrust that could exploit the slightly exposed f2 square. Guarding the advanced bishop with a pawn retreat is a subtle yet crucial defensive maneuver, preparing to challenge black's active bishop and prevent further infiltration into white's territory. Guarding the advanced pawn with the king is a sensible consolidation, though it does tie the monarch to its current defensive post, limiting its potential for future offensive forays or rook support. A tactical repositioning, the knight pivots from its advanced outpost, seeking a more active central influence and preparing to join the fight on the queenside where black's bishop is currently causing trouble. Shifting the bishop to the queenside now prepares to contest that crucial open file, potentially unlocking the c-pawn for a late endgame surge. Proactively securing that flank prevents any potential black infiltration on the queenside and prepares for a controlled advance of the pawn, which could become a valuable asset in future exchanges or for creating space for white's pieces. Fleeing the looming pawn storm and preparing to activate the king into the center, this cautious step aims to secure the monarch while keeping options open for pawn breaks. Unleashing the knight to the central outpost creates immediate attacking possibilities, aiming to exploit the exposed black bishop on g7 and potentially disrupt the coordination of black's pieces. Focus shifts to consolidating the advanced knight, aiming to reposition it for maximum pressure on white's central pawns or to support a future kingside pawn push. Pressing the king with a pawn thrust opens up lines for attack, aiming to exploit the current pawn structure and potential weaknesses around black's monarch. Unlocking the g-file offers a sliver of counterplay, but it simultaneously exposes your monarch to potential discovery threats on the open diagonal. Securing the pawn on h7 offers a small material gain and simplifies the position, but it also opens up the king's defense more than might be ideal, potentially creating a weakness down the g-file for later consideration. Bringing the bishop back to the central squares offers potential for a defensive redeployment, but it also allows white's knight to advance and put further pressure on black's pawn structure, especially on the king side. Safeguarding the monarch is paramount. The king's relocation to the safer d3 square aims to shield it from potential checks and solidify white's defensive structure as the game progresses towards an endgame scenario. The knight's retreat to e1 offers a subtle but crucial regrouping. Its previous outpost on d6 felt precarious and perhaps a little exposed, while this repositioning allows it to eye the central squares and prepare for potential defensive maneuvers around your king, or even to join an eventual queenside advance if the opportunity arises. Recognizing the persistent threat to the dark-squared bishop, white chooses to reinforce its position, offering a safe haven from the aggressive dark square control black has meticulously built. The bishop's journey to b3 aims to pressure the d-pawn and potentially create threats on the queen side, but it might be a bit too ambitious given the current piece placement and the white king's relative safety. Unleashing a knight check forces the black king to move, aiming to dislodge the dangerous bishop and potentially expose the king further. A desperate repositioning of the monarch begins, seeking refuge from the encroaching knight and aiming to consolidate before white's pieces overwhelm black's defenses. The knight's repositioning from the center to the edge of the board, a maneuver often seen in king's pawn openings, now aims to achieve a decisive regrouping, potentially creating threats against the black king's sanctuary by preparing a swift advance along the king side. Seeking fresh air for the king, black steers towards the queen side, hoping to find a safer haven amidst white's encroaching knights. The knight's audacious lunge forces the black king out of its hiding spot, aiming to disrupt black's carefully constructed defensive pawn shield and potentially create mating nets. The black king is once again nudged towards the king side, a constant shadow of exposure as white's knight patrols the critical squares. Pushing the pawn forward seizes more central space and forces black's bishop to choose between guarding the f-file or the b-file, potentially creating weaknesses. Seeking to solidify the outpost on d7 and prepare for a potential peace maneuver, black's bishop retreats to a square where it can still influence the central pawns. Restoring the bishop to the c6 square reestablishes a strong defensive outpost, eyeing the a8-h1 diagonal and discouraging any immediate advances by black's king's pawn. This pawn's advance aims to secure vital space on the queen side, preventing white's knight from comfortably re-entering the game on the queen side and simultaneously creating potential attacking avenues down the h-file. King's daring advance into the central arena initiates a fascinating endgame dance where pawn structure dynamics and king's active participation will decide the outcome. Unleashing a pawn's potential, this pawn pushes forward, seeking to disrupt the defender's setup and potentially create a passed pawn on the h-file, a valuable asset in this nearing endgame. Shifting the monarch towards the center opens up avenues for a more active role, aiming to support the pawn on f5 and potentially participate in the eventual pawn push on the king side, while also providing safety from potential threats on the queen side. This pawn advance on the king side opens up a crucial avenue for black's bishop, aiming to challenge white's centralized king and potentially create discovered attacks or even mating threats. Pioneering a fresh avenue on the queen side, this pawn thrust endeavors to seize initiative and create a passed threat, potentially forcing black's pieces into defensive postures. unlocking the kingside pressure now with the bishop's retreat, aiming to reroute it to potentially harass white's advanced pawns or support a bold central pawn push, creating dynamic counterplay. Pondering a retreat for the king signifies white's attempt to find a more secure square, anticipating black's active pieces and potential for pawn advancement. Focusing the king's safety amidst the queenside pawn advances will be paramount for black now, as white's knight repositions to eye the vulnerable bishop pair. The king boldly advances, aiming to support the pawn push and exploit the open lines, a risky maneuver as it strays from its protective pawns. Navigating the labyrinth of this complex endgame, the black king ventures towards a more active role, seeking sanctuary and potential counterplay amongst the advancing pawns and watchful bishops. Unleashing a pawn hammer blow, this move forces the black king into a precarious corner, threatening immediate checkmate or a devastating discovery if the king attempts to escape. The king is being drawn into the fray, a risky gambit exposing it to danger as white's f-pawn marches forward, aiming to shatter black's pawn structure and open lines for the bishop. Consolidating the monarch's safety by repositioning the king to avoid immediate checks and potential discovered threats across the board becomes paramount. Shifting the bishop to this active diagonal unlocks potential threats and aims to reposition it for better coordination with the knight, potentially creating a battery or supporting a pawn advance. The white king ventures into potentially hazardous territory, abandoning the safety of pawn cover and venturing towards the kingside, hoping to support its remaining forces and perhaps escape the immediate threats of black's bishop and rook. Repositioning the bishop to this square aims to contest the key diagonal and potentially activate the piece later, while also preparing to support the rook's advance along the c-file or create a more stable pawn structure. The knight's leap to b6 aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses for future exploitation.